Hello, and welcome to Ending Physician Overwhelm. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Mello. I'm a family and obesity medicine physician, as well as a certified life coach for physicians. In this podcast, we talk about how the learned habits of people-pleasing, perfectionism, and a lack of boundaries show up in our lives and how they contribute to burnout, exhaustion, and overwhelm. The healthcare system is broken, my friends, but let's not wait for it to be fixed in order to feel better. All right. Well, hello and welcome everyone to another special guest episode. I'm delighted today to be joined by my friend and fellow family and obesity medicine physician, Dr. Sarah Stombaugh. She's going to give herself an introduction here, but I think we're looking forward to a really great conversation today. So, Sarah, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you so much for having me today. I am really excited to share, as I learned a little bit more about the work that you do, I think this physician burnout space is so important. And in a lot of ways, I see myself on really the other side of my burnout. And that has been such a cool journey to go through. Maybe I wouldn't say that initially, but to be here where I'm at now, seeing the things that I've learned, I'm excited to talk a little bit about my story with you all.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective. None of us is excited to experience burnout, overwhelm, kind of have these big moments in our lives that feel so hard. And yet, as we, evolve and sort of get to the other side of things, we don't necessarily have to feel regret and sit here wishing it didn't happen, even though I don't have to be excited about, all the difficult parts of the journey, or that this just has become part of medical care. But before we get too deep into that, tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your practice.
Yes, absolutely. So I am a family medicine physician by training, as you mentioned, and also board certified in obesity medicine. And my background, of course, is in primary care. I was practicing outpatient primary care as an employed physician for a while. And then when we relocated to Charlottesville, Virginia, a couple of years ago, I decided to open my own practice. And so at this point, I'm doing just weight loss, medical weight loss. I have a practice in Charlottesville, Virginia, in which I do that. And it's been great because I'm working to build my business, create this life that is really exciting for me and our family. My husband's also a physician. He has a very demanding career, lots of nights, lots of call, weekends, holidays, that type of thing. And so it's important for me to have be sort of the more stable person at home. We have 3 young children who are 5, 3, and 1. And I love that opportunity to decide what do I want and how to create this balance between both of those 2 things, which is certainly not easy.
Yeah. Well, and I think, so many of us go into family medicine and, we want to use those broad skills. And yet, our special sauce, the thing that makes us really good and effective with patients, may not jive with the potential sort of call opportunities and, the ability to work all day, every day in just about any setting. Right.
Mhm.
So when we can find, some aspect of medicine that we really love, that we really feel great about doing, that also fits into, our personality and just, kind of what we want to give to the world. I think it's such a beautiful matchup.
Mhm. Yeah, I could not have said it better myself, and that's exactly why I was in primary care, and that's exactly why I'm at where I'm at now.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that story a little bit, and sort of tell people, because I don't know that this was your original plan to, open your own practice, but I know that that's certainly not where you started.
Mhm.
And we've talked a little bit about your burnout, but tell people listening, kind of how that looked for you, because I think your story is really valuable for others to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just to give it even some years and some timeline here, I graduated from residency and I had my first child the day before residency graduation. So it was really like June 18th, or I guess June 19th, I had my son. June 20th was graduation. I missed graduation, which was
Good.
really still disappointed. Still disappointed all these years later. Um, but I didn't really have a maternity leave so much as I had the time in between residency and my first job, in which I was also, a lot of people take that opportunity. They travel, they kick back, and they relax. And I had a newborn.
Yeah.
And and that was That was what it was. I had about 10 weeks off between those two things and started my attending job as full-time outpatient primary care at a large hospital system in the Chicago area. And that's where we had done residency. My husband was still in training, so we knew we would be in that area for a few years longer. And so I started my job fall of 2018, and I really it was actually great. You know, it was full time. I was seeing patients 34 clinical hours a week and was able to create a schedule that made a lot of sense for my family at the time.
Mm,
Um, had gotten into some good, had a lot of nerves about creating some of those boundaries. We had some nights
yeah.
and weekends, and that was just part of all of the hospital systems in that area, sort of wanting to compete for patients, competing for availability. But I actually had carved it out in a way that it was okay. You know, I worked
Mm,
Wednesdays until 8 p.m., but that means I started at 1 p.m. And so when my
mm,
infant
mm,
woke up at 6 a.m., I had like, 6, 7, 8 hours of the day with him. And I actually felt, even when that was the case, that was okay. And when I worked
mhm,
Saturdays, my husband was able to create his residency schedule or his call schedule that he never had to take call in those days. So it was sort of this
mm.
opportunity for him to spend time with our son,
Yeah.
and things were good. But I was also building a new patient panel. My practice, it was pretty booked from day one, seeing patients at probably 95% capacity, but that left just the wiggle room. So I didn't have this
Mhm.
huge panel of patients who had a million paperworks to fill out and the prior authorizations that it takes a while to build up.
Yeah.
And it was in that building up, I you can imagine I started fall of 2018. So that building up was happening, and then a year and change later, we hit the pandemic.
Yeah.
And that, I think for so many people, just really rocked my world. I actually came into the pandemic, so March 2020, I'd been in a job that I really, at that time, if you asked me, we probably would have stayed there forever. We were
Mm,
thinking about what our long-term opportunities were. I had a good system in place. I had a good workout routine. I just had this schedule and life felt pretty stable. And the pandemic just, shook that and took me to my core. And the biggest part of that for me is that I was 6 months pregnant in March of
mm.
2020. And so found myself in a situation where, early on, we didn't know what was the risk to pregnant women. We didn't
It was terrifying.
know. It was complete.
Yeah, I was taking care of pregnant women. We all of a sudden couldn't see anyone, and we were trying to figure out,
Mhm.
what do we do? How are we gonna provide safe care? And you on the other side
Yeah.
of it, having a little too much knowledge and being pregnant yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was such a weird, right, like, they're, like, canceling my prenatal visits. I'm like, "Aren't these important? Like, I
Right,
think I
yeah.
need
You
these."
told us these were important.
Right, like, what I don't know, like, what's the risk versus benefit there?
Yeah,
And that's what we were trying to figure out. And so in the situation where there's not a vaccine yet, the personal protective equipment was questionable,
yeah,
and our hospital system was trying to find a way to cover all of the inpatient. I was a completely outpatient physician, and there was this
yeah,
huge influx of need for inpatient providers. And they started asking all of the outpatient providers to step up in that way.
yeah,
And it was challenging because then looking at how do we, when we don't have enough volunteers for these roles, how do we start to fill those? Who are the people who are going to be the best fit for that? And so it was at that point that I was asked to work in an inpatient role. They had sort of ranked all of the physicians in order from youngest to oldest, youngest being
yeah,
healthiest, oldest being
yeah,
least healthy.
yeah.
And while I get that logic, I was also six
But you
months
were also
pregnant.
pregnant. They didn't
And that was
calculate that part.
right,
They rarely
exactly.
do.
And everybody had their own
Yeah,
situation, and I'm so aware of that, but it was in that where I went from feeling like an individual who was part of this team to feeling like, okay, maybe I am just a number, that sort of
mhm,
metaphorical cog in a wheel. Do they even care about me as a person? And ultimately, I put down an ultimatum and said, like, if you do this, I'll quit. And they said, well, we do actually still need you, and we won't make you do that. And so, but thank God, because it was like, hey,
yeah,
we need you to do this role. And I knew that I absolutely did not feel comfortable being in that position.
yeah,
Um, My husband's also a critical care physician, so he was in that position.
Yeah.
And it's like, can we be in a place where both parents are separating from their child? And it did not make sense for our
Yeah.
family. So I continued to work in the outpatient setting with appropriate PPE, really reduced clinical hours because of the way our system had set things up. Went on maternity leave in June of 2020 when I had our second child. And then I came back in September to just this really different work environment. And I think a
Mm,
lot of people can probably resonate with that. But it was a situation where my work environment had gone from really pretty stable, and now I've taken a break and I've come back in. Things have been totally shaken up. They had offered retirement packages to all of the physicians and
mhm,
nurses in our system, and most of the nurses in our practice had taken that retirement package. So we had 10
mm.
physicians in our outpatient office, and we had 1 RN when I came back from
Oh, wow.
maternity leave who's doing all of the triage of phone
Right.
calls, of all of the incoming in-basket messages
And
that you
in
would
a
get on Epic.
system where it was designed around having that kind of support.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. And so, the role that I had had previously, you'd have this phenomenal team of nurses who would triage things, they would pass along the appropriate messages, and now all of a sudden there was just nobody doing
Right.
that role.
Yeah.
And so it went from, like, if I didn't do it, there were messages that would go unread for 7, 10 plus days, and,
Yeah.
as any physician listening here knows, sometimes those messages were, "Where can I get my flu shot?" and things like that, but
Sometimes
sometimes they
it's,
were,
"I'm having chest
"Yeah,
pain."
right, I'm having chest pain, my blood sugar is 500, what should I do?" And so the liability of those type of messages sitting in an
Yeah.
in basket somewhere is just too great, and
Yeah.
so I took on that burden, as most of the other physicians in our practice also did, to just
Yeah.
start getting basically every message that was sent to me was sent to me. There was no filter there.
Yeah.
And adding that, basically it all boils down to I've got my now sort of regular clinic load, all my patients that were backed up from the pandemic, backed up because of my maternity leave. It's
Mhm.
September, things aren't open, but they're open enough in the clinic where we're seeing people, we're
Right.
back to full volume. I've
Yeah.
got all of that compounded with this role that really was never mine, but needs to be done. And
Yeah.
taking a really major pay cut because
Mm.
I was coming off of a 2-year guarantee and had had really 6 months of very little productivity because of
Mm.
the pandemic and maternity leave. So I came back to this role where I've taken a major pay cut, and working 5 to 10 more hours per week, and it just all of a sudden was like,
Yeah.
"This is not okay." And I
Yeah.
quickly went from, "This is a great job," to, "How can I escape this?"
Well, and I wanna come back to this point because you mentioned, the liability of, like, these unread messages, and they can be sort of terrible things. There's kind of that legal liability, of course, but also kind of, I don't know, the emotional or moral liability, right?
Yes.
Because that I think is the big driver that keeps us overworking. Of course, none of us wants to get sued, none of us wants to deal with that. That's a terrifying experience for so many. But but the harm that we fear, right, of missing something important then creates
Mhm.
this hypervigilance in us, which then, just really compounds the overwhelm, the burnout that we feel. And I know that a lot of people listening will really resonate with that part of
Mhm.
it because although you probably would say, "Yeah, I'm worried about being sued," right? That wasn't the real
Right.
liability, was it?
Mhm. Well, and that ownership that you take of your patients, and this, I am here to be their partner in their healthcare, and here they are vulnerably reaching out with a genuine
Yeah,
question that they have,
yeah,
and they deserve to have that question answered, and so really feeling that responsibility to be able to support them in that way.
yeah. So tell us then what happened next. So you're in this position, you're, overworking because that feels like the only appropriate thing that you can do. You're making less money. You've got 2 young children at home.
Mhm.
Um, finish that story for us, because of course that's a
Yeah.
story that resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, so it went on like this for a few months. So September, October, November, December, I was just like, "Oh, things will get better," and you just kind of, I allowed myself to be sort of in that situation, sort of the martyrdom of like, this is what I have to do. And also knowing from a patient care standpoint, there was, while I'd had this decrease in my salary, there was an opportunity to make some of that up in bonuses. So there's also that drive of
Sure.
like, we finances went from being like okay to finances are really tight now. We're living in the
Right,
city of
because
Chicago.
childcare
We
was
have a
costing more,
full-time
like, all sorts
nanny.
of things were costing more.
Totally. Yeah, my husband's still in training, so he's not making that much money. Like, we felt that, and so that working harder, in some ways, I'm like, this is what I have to do in order to make that money because I
Yeah.
need that money available to me. And so for a couple of months it went on, but then it just became such a heavy burden. And I actually, there was a physician in our local moms group who had recently trained as a life coach or was training as a life coach and needed to get some sessions in order to, I don't remember if she was offering them for free because she was
Mhm.
finishing her training and needed some more hours, or if she was just offering them as a benefit. But either way, it was a benefit to me for sure. She offered those up in the physician group locally, and a bunch of people reached out. I raised my hand and she drew from a hat, and my name was one that was drawn. And to that point, I had never heard of coaching. Or not really, I hadn't,
You
maybe
probably
sort of
heard the
aware
word
that it,
life coach, but what does that mean?
right,
Right?
exactly.
What does
Like I
that
was
mean for a physician?
aware, right, like aware that this is a thing, but is that going to have any applicability to me?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I'm desperate. She's offering this thing for free. Why not? And I will tell you, that hour of my life really changed the trajectory of my entire life. We had such a wonderful session where we were talking about, my husband at this point is starting to think about applying for jobs. That's going to be
Mhm.
now, it's December of 2020. We're thinking he's going to finish training in summer of 2021. So he's starting to apply for jobs. We're starting to think about what's next. I've got this all of a sudden like, wow, actually, I hate this job and I don't want this. What are we going to do? The world's our oyster. It's so overwhelming. And that session just condensed it down to this sort of constant worry that I have of like, what's the next step? And am I abandoning my patients? And being able to bring myself back into the day, back into the moment. And it was from there that after having that hour, I'm like, I need more of this. And where can I find it? And so I enrolled in a coaching program for female physicians, did that program, and that really, I did it for a personal reason, right? To sort of get
Mhm.
all of these things, work through, see the experiences of other physicians. And I started to see where I did have authority in my life, where I did have autonomy, the places it was said to me, learn to love before you leave. And that was such a
Mhm.
powerful tool of, if I'm going to leave, whether it's a job or this could be applicable in other places,
Yeah.
but what are the things that you love about it? What are the ways that you are showing up that could be different? Where could you be more efficient? Where could you be drawing boundaries? What are the things that you can really optimize this opportunity? And from there, decide, is this the right fit for me or do I move on? And
Yeah.
so it was through that work got a lot better. So I still was
Mhm.
in that same environment, but I learned a lot of things in terms of charting efficiency, and I'm an efficient charter, right? Like I grew up typing on a computer. I'm young. I had all the dot
Right.
phrases, but things that I became a B minus charter. I'm sure your clients have
Mhm.
heard of that before,
Mhm.
but going from having notes that were very well curated to notes that were just relaying the
They were just
information with,
good enough.
yeah,
Yeah.
grammatical errors
Yeah.
sometimes and typos, and like that's
Right.
okay, but they
Yeah.
relayed what they needed to relay. Really
Yeah.
working on batching my work, carving out boundaries of how I interacted with my staff on some of those things. And all of a sudden, it was still a job that ultimately was too much for what my life was at that time, with
Yeah.
two young children, with a husband who had this demanding job. And I still got to decide that this isn't what I want for my future. But in
Mhm.
that interim, it got so much
So much
better.
better. Yeah.
And that's really the crux of it, is like that was a place where I really could have been for a long time if I
Yes.
hadn't also been bit by the entrepreneurial bug.
Yes. Yes. No, very similar story, of feeling so much better after just hearing some of the coaching tools. And That sounds a little bit like we've drunk some, crazy Kool-Aid, but I think for so much of our training and, our work as employed physicians, we just feel like we're getting beaten up by all sides,
Mhm.
and especially if you lose staff and maybe you never felt that empowered to utilize the staff because, in your socialization, right? You don't want to be the demanding one. You don't want to be the rude one. You don't want to be the one
Mhm.
who adds all this work. You want to be the easy one because that's, how you've been rewarded. Um, and we don't realize how much agency we have, how much autonomy. We don't realize it's safe to set boundaries or, take care of ourselves in those environments. I agree. It
Mhm.
makes a huge difference to sort of have that realization and to get that clarity before you figure out what am I doing next.
Mhm. Well, and to see there are so many places in which I had autonomy. And it's
Mhm.
funny because you hear different things phrased different ways just by different people or at the
Yeah.
right stage of your life.
Yeah.
And I was walking into work one day and I was listening to a podcast and it said, you do not have to go to work. Like you can turn around, you can walk back to your car. And I was
Right.
like, do they know? I'm like
What?
literally walking into work as they say this. I'm like, does she know that I'm walking into work right now? And it's like, you don't have to, right?
Mhm.
There are consequences if you
Mhm.
don't.
Mhm.
But you could literally just not show up
You
to
could
work one
choose to
day.
never go back. You could.
You could, and, like,
Yeah.
that is actually an option, and I'm choosing not to. I'm choosing to walk into the building right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a little thing, but it can really dramatically sort of shift your perspective of like we think it's required, right? We think that like we're literally in handcuffs being dragged into that. And when you realize that's not true
Mhm,
and you can make your own choices, even if nothing else is different, right? It's like,
mhm.
oh, no, I am choosing to do this. Today, I am choosing to go and see my scheduled patients or do my, my call or whatever it is. And I realize I can start to choose something different,
Mhm.
even if that feels scary, undoable, because I thought that this was my only choice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
and seeing that positivity, I think about I would, after every single visit, have like, in my mind, what is one thing that was really positive about that encounter? And whether
Mm,
it was about how I showed up or my relationship with them or how I drew a boundary around time, and that really helped to shape
huge.
where my mindset was throughout the day.
Yeah. You're choosing to intentionally look at something good rather than notice all the things that didn't go right. They were late. I was
Mhm.
late. That note's going to take forever. I can't believe they brought up 14 things. No, like just having that moments of notice because, right, it tunes our brain to notice the good, to look for the good,
Mhm.
to anticipate that question that you're going to answer yourself, right? You start to answer in advance, right? Of
Mhm.
like, look for the good as we go through this, even if it's really difficult.
Yeah, exactly. And that creates the like, that's your lived experience, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is not just a thought process, but it creates like, that is your life, and
Yeah.
is your life enjoyable? Is your life miserable? And where is it that you can have where you can
Yeah.
influence and have a say in that?
Yeah. Well, let's pivot and talk about another shared passion that we have. I think part of going through that particular coach training that we did with the life coach school is really paying attention to how our default mode then affects our decisions, and our actions.
Mhm,
So in our training, we it might be called numbing or buffering, but what comes up for so many physicians that you and I both see as patients, but also that we bump into as colleagues is a lot of, we'll just call them bad habits to label them something where people find themselves overeating, maybe over drinking, being on their phones too much, and, kind of stuck in this state where they feel like everything is their fault and they ought to know better. And yet they find
mhm.
themselves doing these behaviors over and over again. Tell me a little bit about, anything you'd like to share with your experience of going through that training and how that
Mhm.
showed up in your outside of medicine life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I so I experienced coaching as a client, and then, as you're sort of talking about here, I realized, wow, these are all the tools that my patients need. And as a primary care physician, certainly, but at that point, I was already doing obesity medicine just as part of my primary care work. And I realized how applicable so many of those tools were to my patients. And so I went through coach certification, and it was so interesting, this idea of buffering, which is basically sort of escapism. Like when we are having these negative emotions, what we do in order to not feel a negative emotion. And for most of the patients in my clinic, that's overeating behaviors. But as you're saying, it can be so many different things. But it was funny to see the ways in which that was coming up in my own life, like certainly with eating, the late night, I would come home, I would put, a lot of times I would like get straight home. I would be putting two kids to bed. My husband would still be at work. And it would be just this like the last, 12, 13, 14, 15 hours of my day had been so
Yeah.
frustrating
Yeah.
that I just felt this like big overwhelm, negative emotion or set of negative emotions. It was like, I just need to escape from that. And, I can talk about that in a sort of logical way then, or now, but at that point, it was just like, oh, I feel terrible. And would sort of find myself either into food or just like mindlessly scrolling on my phone, doing things that absolutely did not help me feel better in the long run, but they were
Mhm.
this escape from just that bled that had been that terrible
It
workday
felt very
followed by.
necessary, right? It
Right,
felt
yeah.
necessary to, be on your phone and, like, treating yourself to something after such a terrible day or, yeah,
Mhm,
eating the cookies that you didn't intend to eat, right? It's so easy, and it comes up over and over again.
mhm. It's like, I deserve this, and, like, and you do, right? Like, I and you and anybody, like, you deserve to be treated well. You deserve to take care of oneself. You deserve many of these things, but unwinding into a sleeve of Oreos, like, is not actually meeting that need at
Probably
all.
not what we actually want. It's probably not the self-care that we really need, right?
Right, exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's such an issue, and I talk a lot with my patients who are physicians or healthcare workers about how, kind of the culture of medical care, and that could be clinic or hospital, to be quite honest, really often sets people up in particular for struggles with their eating behaviors. Because we may not be able to eat, when we feel hungry because, we're in clinic, we're in surgery, we're rounding, there's all these patients, the ER is slammed, whatever it is. And so we often will fall into this pattern where, we're kind of under eating for large parts of the day and then we overeat. And of
Mhm.
course, we're often in these environments where there's always donuts in the break room, or, yeah, people have brought treats, or the
Graham
hospital
crackers and peanut butter.
cafeterias with terrible food, right? And I didn't have time to pack anything, or I did pack something, but I'm gonna eat that pizza instead. Um,
Mhm.
and for our people who work in healthcare or other helping professions, I think that you and I have both found, right, that sort of binge eating and weight gain, end up being sort of this consequence of this overworking burnout, kind of cycle.
Mhm.
What have you seen as you've been practicing more obesity medicine?
Absolutely. So there's sort of formal binge eating disorder, and it's very common that I have conversations with people where they don't meet the criteria for binge eating disorder, but they're like
You're
binge eating
so
disorder
close.
light. Yeah, they're so close,
Right,
right? And like
right.
that emotional eating is not normal either. Like that is not a healthy relationship with our hunger, with our satiety, with knowing what our body needs. And it's easy to see how in medical training, as you were saying, how that can develop. And so there's this really intentional paying attention to that can really make a difference because I think so often, I remember like hunger being an emotion for me. Like
Mhm,
hunger felt really scary. Hunger
mhm.
felt really like victimy, like, oh my gosh, I have no idea when the next time I'm going to be able to eat is,
Right.
which is such a wild thing to say because it's not like I'm gonna go days without food. We're talking
Right.
about hours, right? We're
Right.
talking about I could probably I not could probably, I could definitely survive. Like, I'm not going to
Right.
die. I'm
We're
not
not
going to
actually on
die.
the verge of cachexia and starvation. But yes, we may not be able to eat for a few hours.
Right, exactly. And
Yeah.
so part of that is like, what is the planning here? And have I had any? And is there some planfulness that I can bring to the situation? But just the awareness of, okay, what is it that my body actually needs? How can I lean into that? When I feel hunger coming up, what else comes up for me? I mean, one of my really most embarrassing stories that I share often is a time I was on night float in residency and our cafeteria closed at 7. And so we used to do sign out at 6, and then you would like run downstairs, you would get food right before the cafeteria closed, and it was fine. And one night I got down there at like 7:02 and all the lights were still on. The food was all still out. Like
Yeah.
everybody who worked there was still there. And I walked up and they were like, "Oh, I'm sorry, the cafeteria is closed." And I'm looking at the food. And I was like, "But I'm so hungry." And I just started sobbing. I mean, like genuinely sobbing
Yeah.
because I was so hungry. And what ultimately happened is that the cafeteria worker, who was so flabbergasted in this situation, just gave me a bunch of food for free because the cash registers
Yeah.
ultimately
They'd
was the
already
reason
signed out and they're like,
yeah,
"Just."
the cash registers were closed out. Like everything was, they couldn't, I couldn't pay for the food. So ultimately I walked away with free food. So maybe the lesson there is just sob every time you need food and you'll get free food. But it was just such this wake up call to like, why did tears come? Like, why did I start sobbing in that
Yeah.
situation? And is that really an appropriate response to the situation that I was in? And so starting to pay attention to, I recognized, okay, I really feel like a victim in this situation. I really feel like the cafeteria is closed. I'm going to be in the hospital for the next 12 hours and I'm not going to have any access to food. And now I'm only going to have the vending machines. And I start sort of going into this snowball.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I've told this story back a number of times, and it's so silly, right? And anybody who hears that story probably also hears the silliness, but they can also relate to times where we may have felt very similarly.
Yeah. Absolutely. It pulls to my mind, how much struggle, we had during those years in particular with just getting our basic needs met. Because
Mhm.
yes, like there was probably this emotional component to it of like, I've worked so hard and I just like, I need to eat, I deserve to eat. But also, it's true that we did not get, normal access to food, normal
Mhm.
access to sleep, or ability to use the bathroom, right? Because there really was, especially during, residency and medical school, when you're on the wards, there's this mentality of you and your needs always come last. Every once in a
Mhm.
while, someone would tap you on the shoulder and be like, hey, scrub out and go eat or something. But and then you didn't want to because you're like, no, no, no. I've
Mhm.
got to prove that I'm the dedicated one who's going to stick around.
Totally.
But also at that time, as you look back, as part of you even is saying silly, you also were not getting your needs met, and
Mhm.
repetitively so.
Mhm.
And how does that set us up, when we graduate to be these creatures, who really struggle sometimes to take breaks and get our needs met. And that's just our basic needs, let alone,
Right.
leisure time, rest, fun with our families or our friends, true vacations where we're not dealing with 100 open charts, all of these very
Mhm.
true realities. It's so complicated. And I think it's always so helpful for other people to hear that they're not alone,
Mhm.
right? Because I can guarantee you that a lot of people are like, oh, yeah, I remember crying in the cafeteria, you know?
Yeah.
Or, I thought I was going to be able to go lay down and then I don't know, a Whipple walked in, that, like some
Mhm.
special thing walked in that was a special opportunity, and they could no longer go and take care of their needs.
Mhm.
And these very conflicted emotions. Talk a little bit, if you will, about how when we go through when we get coaching, when we learn the tools, like, how do we stop that numbing sort of behavior? How do we learn to address that?
I think of recognizing that it's a pattern that's been practiced for a long time. So there's this really deep wiring that has happened in your brain of have whatever we often have a very specific thought pattern that leads to it of but sort of whatever negative emotion, whatever for me, for example, I'm having this sort of overwhelm at the end of the day, this just feeling really like I deserve something good. It's been such a rough day. I need this sort of escape. And
Yeah.
that is leading me to a place of it, overeating or like turning to a sweet snack or that scrolling on my phone. And so a lot of times it's that awareness that it's even happening. I think a lot of
Mhm.
us, it happens so automatically because it's really not a conscious decision, right? A
Right.
lot of times it's really happening. We're not unconscious, but it's just like this subconscious brain. There's this habit that is there that has been practiced so many times that you can do it really automatically. Our brain is phenomenal at developing habits. And so it's this work through breaking habits in a lot of way, this work in sometimes building in pauses that just
Mhm.
give your brain enough of an opportunity that you can stop that sort of fast moving train, that you
Right.
can stop it and divert it to another pathway.
Right.
And sometimes initially that looks like just an awareness that it happened. And so after you've had an episode where maybe you're feeling guilty or like, I can't believe I just, ate that or did that online shopping or did scrolled for an hour or whatever the thing is, that instead of feeling guilty, to stop and just reflect on what actually happened.
Yeah.
A lot of times I think this is really best done with the assistance of another person, whether that's a coach, whether it's a therapist, but stopping to reflect on what actually happened and then starting to imagine, okay, how could that go differently next time? Why did that happen? What would build in a pause that maybe just stop and think? I love the book Atomic Habits by James
Mhm.
Clear. That is one of my all-time favorite books. And I this idea of how do we make our bad habits more challenging? How do we make our
Mhm.
good habits more easy to access? And sometimes those things just build in these pauses that allow our thoughts to catch up to our actions. And so allow us to bring more intentionality rather than just sort of acting from this primitive part of our brain that acts
Right.
reflexively all the
Right.
time.
And then to get very judgmental and mean about ourselves afterwards, right? Because that's
Right.
often the pattern as well. We're type A, we're hardworking. I shouldn't struggle with this. I shouldn't struggle with my eating. I shouldn't struggle, I shouldn't be on my phone for hours. It's very normal if that's you and that's how you learn to cope with these emotions. But I agree, like, gaining some awareness. It's not that you're never going to feel angry, overwhelmed, sad, defeated. Like, you're going to have those emotions. But when we know sort of, to pause and sort of recognize that, it just, yeah, it gives us a chance to decide, how do I want to take care of myself in this moment? Sometimes
Mhm.
I might still choose the Oreos, but
Mhm.
there's at least an opportunity to say, "No, I'm feeling really sad because I had to give somebody, really bad news today, and, I could choose to have Oreos, but, I can also just choose to be compassionate with myself and do something else, that helps to soothe that sadness that I feel."
Yeah. Well, and I
Yeah.
think, an interesting thing you said is, you still may feel the overwhelm or the anger or the frustration or the sadness. But the interesting thing is that I wasn't feeling those, right?
Mhm.
Like I was never I would have this like knowing that I was frustrated, but I wasn't like stopping to allow that. It was that
Yeah.
resistance of the
Yeah.
negative
Pretending it's
emotions.
not there. I shouldn't feel
Right.
frustrated. Yeah.
Right. This like shoving it down. And the interesting thing is like learning to feel your feelings, which sounds like such a fundamental tool that I don't know, like nobody ever taught me.
Yeah.
I went into some of this. I had never done therapy before. Coaching was really my first step into any of this
Yeah.
mental health realm.
Yeah.
And my entire emotional repertoire was like happy, sad, frustrated, anxious, angry. Like I think
Yeah.
those were my, 5 emotions. I
Yeah.
really didn't have the nuance to understand what was my body actually feeling and to give nod and pay attention and allow the compassion for those emotions because I was actually having this human experience that needed to be experienced instead of just like the shoving it down, which is what was actually
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's so powerful. I'm glad that you mentioned that. I have a feeling we could go on for forever. So
I
maybe we'll
think
have
so.
to have you back. But for someone who's listening and they find themselves in your story, what do you want them to know? What's one little pearl that you'd like to leave them with?
I think knowing that other people are going through or have gone through this, wherever you are, is just a chapter in your story. Your story can continue on and can look however you want to write it. And that may feel very hypothetical, but there are people, whether it's someone like you, whether it's another coach, whether it's a therapist, there are people that can help you through a really difficult time.
Yeah.
And working to it can look different. It can look better than it does right now. And so, I don't know, I feel like when I was in it, I really didn't know that that was possible. And so for the
Yeah.
person who feels like it's just hopeless, it's gonna be bad forever, I just have to slug it out the rest of my career, I'm thinking about retiring early. Like,
Right.
if those are your thoughts, there is someone, whether it's Dr. Mello, whether it's someone else, there are people who can help you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's so important because you do feel so, I mean, that's just part of kind of the shame that we experience when we're feeling overwhelmed and burned out, blaming ourselves for feeling that way and feeling like we must be the only one.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
that's so helpful. Um, where can people find you if they are curious about your work? I'd love to hear more about your podcast.
Yes, absolutely. So, my practice is in the Charlottesville, Virginia area. I see patients throughout Illinois and Virginia for medical weight loss. And I have a podcast called Conquer Your Weight. We talk about all aspects of weight loss, but really love to hone in on some of this thought work and what is that psychological aspect of our weight struggles and why do we struggle? Not just what to do, but what do we do when it gets challenging? And so, for people who are interested in that, I would love for them to join me at Conquer Your Weight. You can either find that at conqueryourweight.com or in any of the major podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Conquer Your Weight.
Great. Thank you so much. And we'll have all that information in the show notes for people. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a really great conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right, my friends, that's what we have for you this week. Thanks for tuning in as always. And until next time, take care. Bye. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you as always for listening. To learn more about my coaching programs, head to www.healthierforgood.com. And if you love this podcast, please drop us a review on iTunes or support the show by clicking the link in the show notes. Until next time, take care.